Part one of what is GIS looked at basic definitions of GIS, some examples, and talked about the components of GIS. We introduced the functionality of GIS, but that's what I'd like to talk about in more detail at this point. So let's get started. What makes GIS different than other systems or information systems? Well, based on the first recording, you know now that GIS has the specific ability to look at spatial information. That is very much different than the way you can visualize information in simple spreadsheets or databases. Having all that information display on a map with location data associated with other data is really what differentiates it. As you watch the following slides, think to yourself, what are some of the things you can do with GIS? Right? You'll look at some of the specific pieces of functionality, but you could take a look and think to yourself, where could this piece of functionality be used or applied in something that you're interested in? And then finally, what other technologies are related to GIS? Does any of this sound familiar to you as you go through it? So let's get started on the next slide. We know now that there are some basic components of GIS, the people that operate them, the data that GIS uses, the hardware that GIS software runs on, the software itself, and what we didn't talk about but is equally important are the procedures that we use. Each week as you do labs in this class, you're going to be seeing very detailed procedures with screenshots of all the interfaces that you'll be using in GIS. Those are found in the tutorials. As we go into the assignments each week, now you won't have the procedures and screenshots, but you can refer back to what you did in the tutorial. They build on themselves that way. So those are the components: people, data, hardware, software, and procedures. And they all play a critical role. But let's talk about the functionality of GIS. We introduced this in the last slide deck, but let's look at it in more detail. Those GIS functions are the ability to capture information. Once it's captured, store it, being able to go through and query that information, meaning ask questions of it. Once we have it, we can run some analysis or analyze that data in lots of different ways, and we'll get into that in this class. The display, what you might think of as cartography, but it's a lot more than that when you think about how you can display data, not just on the map, but cartography display or cartographic display is a big piece of GIS functionality. And then finally, output. It's not simply maps, but the results of some of that analysis and data manipulation and storage that is really going to be proving useful for specific problems you might address. So let's look at each in turn. Capturing data. Traditionally, data for maps was captured on hard copy maps. So just like some of the early explorers might have had some basic hard copy paper maps of the areas they were exploring or creating them as they went, paper maps are a big source of hard copy or original data. In the geographic information system world, oftentimes we'll scan these hard copy maps and then produce different kinds of data after that. Digital data, data that's already been digitized or is in electronic form, can come from lots of different places. Here we show a CD, but it's an old image. Really, most data now will be downloaded through the internet. And we'll explore some of those data sources, digital data sources, as the class goes on as well. In the lower left, you see coordinates. So an actual point, such as latitude and longitude, or even the center of an address location, like a property center, could be a specific coordinate that is used to store information. And sometimes those coordinates come from GPS or global positioning systems, where they give us those pinpoint locations on the surface of the Earth. So capturing all that information are ways that we can pull that information and capture it and bring it into GIS. Once we have it, we want to store it. Two key terms that you need to remember from this Intro to GIS class is vector and raster. We store spatial information in one of two ways, predominantly. One is vector and one is raster. So let's talk about each briefly. We'll get into this more in Unit 3 or 4. Vector formats are known as discrete representations of reality. When we say discrete, that means a very finite location. So an X and Y or latitude longitude is a discrete location. It allows us to specify precisely where a point is. As you see from the diagram, that the x and y points are all laid out, and when we connect them, we get lines. So that's a representation of multiple points connected, gives us lines. And if we loop those lines back on each other, if we went from the lower right and drew a straight line back to the top left, we would create a very slender but polygon nonetheless. That polygon is an area. So vector format allows us to create very precise or discrete locations or point locations. When they're connected, they form lines, and when those lines touch back on each other, they form polygons. Very discrete. Raster, on the other hand, is very similar to what you might find in a digital picture. If you take your camera out and take a picture, then go back to the computer and zoom in really, really close, you'll have what most people term pixelation, where that image is really just a set of square cells that represent different color values in the picture. It's no different in GIS. Raster data we consider, or we call cell data, and each cell represents a unique value. Now you'll notice the difference though. Raster is not discrete. It is not a precise location. It's continuous across that entire cell. That cell may be very, very small, but still it's not a discrete one point. It's a square cell. So there are inherent benefits to both types of models. On the right here, you'll see a highway that actually represents reality. So that highway would be represented in vector format, like the points connected by lines. It would be represented in raster format, like the multiple cells that form an ongoing line across the screen. But you'll notice already that the designation of that line in raster is a little bit more blocky and chunky and irregular than vector data. That's not always a bad thing, but in this case, it doesn't represent reality quite as well as what the vector does. Again, we'll come back to vector and raster data in Unit 3 or 4, but put it in your brains now and remember it for later. The next functionality is querying, or asking questions of the data, identifying specific features. If you look at the top example, we are searching in the layer called counties for a county called Taylor, and that's the one that's highlighted in blue, as you can see here. So when we select Taylor County in the tool on the left, on the right, we've actually clicked on that and we can see the results. So we're selecting spatially, clicking on one area. We could also do this based on conditions. So for example, each of the counties in Florida might have a population value. We could say, find all counties with a population greater than 300,000. The resulting map will show us and highlight all of those counties where the population value, or attribute, is higher than 300,000. This is pretty useful for quickly identifying a set of information. Now you may say, well, I could take a spreadsheet and sort it by population value and then select all of them, but seeing them on the map and how they relate to one another is really a useful way of looking at data. So we can see right away that there are clusters, or bands, if you will, of adjacent counties that have that high population. Again, this is a way of visually analyzing simply by asking a question of the data or querying it. Once we have all the data, we can run analysis. Now there are multiple ways of analyzing spatial data. The three examples here, and others that we'll go into later on, I believe in Unit 8 or 9, is the analysis type. So first, if you look at the top, we ask which parcels are within 50 feet of a road. In that diagram, the road is bright red, and when we say find all the parcels that are within 50 feet, the light cyan color or blue is what's called proximity, or buffering that road by 50 feet. That cyan color, anything that overlays then, is one of those parcels that are within 50 feet. This is proximity analysis, looking for things that are nearby. We can do that along a line, around a point, or around polygons. An overlay is similar to what we were looking at on our first slide in the very first PowerPoint. We're looking at multiple layers, and when we overlay them together, we can see lots of information. In this particular example, we can see that there was a drilled well that happened to sit right on top of a building or a property owned by the Smith family, and that property sat on top of sandy soils. When we lay all these together and we see this well, for example, that's in red on top of a green property on top of sandy soil on the bottom. That way, in one specific location, we have information about 3 different types of spatial features: the type of well, who owns the building, and the soil underneath. Analysis across a network is also quite interesting. We can do proximity analysis, like drive time. How far can you go in 15 minutes? We all have used GPS for that. In this particular instance, the example shows there's an accident. What's the shortest path to the hospital across a network? Again, this is vector data, where all those points are intersections and the lines of the roads between intersections. And we simply do something called traversing that network to find the shortest path. So analysis is a big part of GIS. Let's move on. Here's an example of running an analysis with multiple layers. We're looking for a location for a new coffee shop that is in an area that's zoned to be used for commercial purposes and has a high population of people in the age group of 18 to 49, the people that spend the most on coffee. So if we look at where those things overlap, where is commercial zoning and high populations of people in that age group, we've identified in cyan on the map the best areas for a new coffee shop, where you have the most number of customers in an area that you know you can build the coffee shop. Let's move on. Displaying the data. So we've captured it, we've stored it, we've run some analysis and querying of the data. Now we want to display the results. There are lots of ways we can output information from GIS. The most common, of course, is a map, which you see here at the top. And this happens to be Yellowstone National Park, and a vegetation study that was done for that particular project. Also, you could display tabular data, or a spreadsheet, if you will, in the form of a report. Or if we want to look at graph of the amount of vegetation in particular areas, we can produce graphs in lots of different types: pie charts, bar charts, those sorts of things. All of this coming from a spatial data set. Lastly, let me just show you an example of that mapping. Here is a mapping that shows the colors, based on color, the amount of storm surge that's occurring in this particular coastal area near Galveston, Texas. So based on the color coding, we can see how much the storm surge would be from the ocean. Very quickly being able to visualize what areas are going to flood at different levels of storm surge. Now, lastly, the output from geospatial technology, or GIS, can go not just to the paper maps and reports and graphs that we showed in visual form, but you could produce a printed map. You can produce images, and we'll show you examples of this in the first lab. You can produce a document, a map document. In the case of ArcGIS, the software we use, you produce something called an MXD, or a map document. Or you could publish your data to the internet. We'll get into that in the cartography class that's GSTC 210 in a subsequent semester. But all of the spatial data you're working with in GIS could be published to the internet. So lots of different output types and formats that we can use. So all of this is meant to give you some idea of what we can use GIS for. And so hopefully, as I was going through this, you identified some thoughts of other types of data you may have worked with in the past and how GIS could be used with that data.